Do you know that so many things happened during prehistoric times, and there are many tribes in Ghana, each with its own unique origin story or migration journey to the land we now call the Gold Coast, now Ghana. The question that often arises is, how did these tribes migrate to the Gold Coast? And what were their motives? In this narrative, Black Stories Untold will delve into the secret behind the origins of all the tribes in Ghana, revealing the untold histories and hidden motives behind their migrations. The region now known as the Gold Coast comprises not only the main colony, but also Ashanti and a portion of the southern Sudan referred to as the Northern Territories. Its coastline stretches from Newtown in the west to Aflao in the east. In addition to the geographically defined Gold Coast, this region includes part of the Slave Coast, located east of the River Volta. It is only in relatively recent times that most of this area has come under European influence, with Europeans rarely venturing more than a few miles inland for centuries. The history of the coastal region is fairly well documented, as various European nations have maintained trading posts there for over 5 centuries. The writings of several authors provide a more or less comprehensive account of different historical periods. Discrepancies between these accounts are largely due to international rivalries, as they were written during a time when multiple European nations were competing for trade along the coast and viewed one another as rivals. Given these circumstances, it is not surprising that each author might favor a version of events that best highlights the achievements of their own country. Aside from these written records, no other documented accounts exist. However, local history has been preserved orally through the generations by linguists, whose remarkable memory skills have ensured that these accounts are highly accurate, especially when cross-referenced with written records. These oral histories are generally reliable regarding the order and occurrence of events, and it is usually possible to estimate approximate dates by correlating them with other contemporary events. The records left by Europeans begin only in the latter part of the 14th century, and none provide accounts of any historical statements the local people might have shared with them about their past. As a result, very little is known about the origins of these tribes, and the accounts that have been passed down and are currently accepted among them are purely traditional. The Gold Coast African rarely emigrates. While they may undertake long journeys for trade, often staying away for years, there is always a tendency to return to their original homeland. The traditionary accounts of past events are mainly obtained from the linguists and higher-class individuals who belong to families that have lived in the same location for as long as anyone can remember. Among such a settled people, tradition holds greater value than it might among more nomadic groups, as the places and natural landmarks associated with their history remain constantly before their eyes, helping to preserve these stories through the generations. The collective essence of these traditions suggests that the Fantis, Ashantis, Wasaus, and in fact all the Twi-speaking or Akan peoples were originally part of a single tribe. They were a pastoral people who lived in the open country beyond the forest belt, further north than Salaga. A lighter-skinned northern people, believed to be the Fulanis, began encroaching on their territory. Being stronger, the Fulanis seized the Akan's cattle and young women, enslaving many others. In response, the Akans began migrating in small groups into the dense forest, where they established small, hidden villages. Over time, the number of these forest-dwelling refugees grew significantly. Eventually, their oppressors became aware of their presence and attempted several times to conquer and enslave them. However, unable to fight effectively in the dense forest and weary of their failures, the northern aggressors eventually ceased their attempts, leaving the Akans in peace. As they continued to live in relative security, their population grew, and they gradually expanded further south, populating the forest belt and eventually reaching the coast. The division of the united Akan race into its two main branches, the Fantis and the Ashantis, is explained in various ways. However, it appears that the split occurred long before these groups reached the coastline, during a time when their primary settlements were located in the region north of the river Pra, in present-day Adansi, and around Techiman. One plausible story suggests that the Akans faced severe food shortages due to relentless raids by their northern enemies who destroyed their farms. As a result, some of them subsisted on a wild plant called fan, while others relied on a plant known as shan. This dietary distinction supposedly led to the names Fan Inti and Shan Inti, Inti meaning to eat. The group that consumed the fan plant eventually migrated further south, while the group that ate the shan plant remained in the more northern areas of the forest. While this story accounts for the origins of the names Fanti and Ashanti, it is notable that the initial A in Ashanti is not pronounced by the local people. It does not clarify the reasons behind their separation. Another explanation suggests that a faction of the people grew dissatisfied with the king and plotted to poison him. According to this account, the names of the two tribes derive from the foods they presented to the king. The Fantis are said to have offered fan, a wild plant, while the Ashantis offered a poisonous herb called asun or aswan. Combined with the verb tsiu, meaning to gather, this provides a linguistic basis for the names. Upon discovering the Ashantis' plot, the king naturally favored the Fantis. However, they were not strong enough to resist the jealousy and oppression of the Ashantis, who ultimately drove them out of the area. Yet another version of the story suggests that a dispute arose among the people, leading them to divide into two factions. One faction moved further south, becoming known as the group that had separated themselves from the main body. The other faction was referred to as the people who did not hearken because they refused to listen to the king's counsel when he tried to broker peace and prevent the Ashantis from expelling the Fantis. This account underscores the internal discord and differing attitudes toward authority that contributed to the eventual division between the Fantis and Ashantis. The Fantis claim that when they arrived, the forest was uninhabited, and some of their people settled there, founding the village of Kwaman. However, the majority continued their journey until they reached the coast. They were reportedly led by three chiefs, Osono, Obrumankoma, and Odapagyan. Upon reaching the coast, they encountered two tribes, the Asebu and Ekis, who had already settled in the region and joined forces to resist the newcomers. Kormantine was said to be the main town of the Asebu, whose chief, Amanfi, a giant by some accounts, led them in battle against the Fantis, defeating them and forcing them to pay tribute. Eventually, however, the Fantis organized a rebellion and succeeded in driving the Asebu into the forest. During this conflict, Amanfi, suffering from guinea worm in his legs and unable to flee, was captured in his house and killed. It is also believed that the Elminas arrived on the coast at a later time and were a branch of the Ashantis. This could explain why, historically, the Ashantis have always been enemies of the Fantis, while the Elminas have maintained consistently friendly relations with them. The accuracy of these accounts is difficult to determine. Although they may be vague and uncertain, they are not implausible and likely contain a fair degree of truth. The Fulanis, for instance, are known to have migrated southward over several centuries. Furthermore, even before the 11th century, Arabs had established states in the interior of Africa, one of the most significant being Ghana, believed to have been located near the current site of Sokoto. Wangara, a region that was part of this state, is a name now associated with a distinct area separate from Ashanti. However, in 1821, Muslims in Kumasi told Mr. Dupuis, the British consul, that Ashanti was once considered part of Wangara. According to Arab historians, the region south of Wangara was known as Lam Lam, inhabited by a race of savages who were hunted and sold into slavery by the people living around the Niger. Additionally, it is well known that Muslim conquests were generally successful in areas where cavalry could be employed, which would have been impractical in the dense forests of Ashanti. This might explain why they failed to subjugate the Akans, who had fled into these thick forests. The challenging terrain, unsuitable for cavalry warfare, likely provided the Akans with a significant strategic advantage against their would-be conquerors. In Winneba and some other coastal areas, there is still a language spoken that is distinctly different from Twi. This language is slowly fading away, but it may well originate from the tribes that were living along the coast at the time of the Fanti migration. If the traditional accounts of the Fantis' conquest are substantially accurate, it does not necessarily mean that these earlier inhabitants were wiped out. It is more likely that they were required to pay tribute to the Fantis. If this were the case, the inherent conservatism of African societies could easily explain why their language and perhaps some of their customs have persisted in certain coastal areas where these earlier tribes settled. The distinct languages spoken by the Akras and Apollonians, in contrast, can be explained by their origins. They are believed to be immigrants from the Slave and Ivory coasts rather than native to the Gold Coast. Notably, the Akras have never successfully established themselves in the dense forest regions. Additionally, the presence of a very primitive race in the area, now occupied by the Fantis, is supported by the discovery of numerous stone tools and weapons. The primary argument that could challenge the overall accuracy of these traditions is the observation that when the Portuguese first settled on the Gold Coast in 1482, they found the population already organized into separate small kingdoms and tribes. This raises the question of whether 4.5 centuries would have provided enough time for the migration through the forest and the development of these distinct tribal identities. However, it's likely that each of these small states arose from the settlement of one of the more powerful immigrant families and their dependents. The family or patriarchal system is a core principle of the Akan social structure, supporting this theory. Another point supporting the belief in a common origin for the Fantis and Ashantis is the existence of several distinct family groups among them. While it is currently impossible to determine their original number, it is certain that some families are of much greater antiquity than others, with the newer families believed to be offshoots from the original stock, often due to internal disputes or other reasons. The main families include the Chwidan, leopard, Ensona, bushcat, Quana, buffalo, Inchwa, dog, Anono, parrot, Abradzi, plantain, Abrutu, cornstalk, Apiadi, servant, and Yoko, red earth. Although there are other families, these are generally considered the oldest. The animals and objects from which these families derive their names are typically regarded as sacred by their members. The names likely originated as descriptive titles for the original heads of these families, a common practice among many primitive peoples. Over time, however, the understanding that these were merely the names of individuals has faded. Subsequent generations have come to regard these animals as their actual ancestors or as the guardian deities, or the abodes of the guardian deities of their families. This evolution in belief reflects the way in which cultural and religious identities can transform over time, rooted in historical traditions that merge with myth and symbolism. Members of these families are found among both the Fantis and Ashantis, and it is difficult to explain this overlap unless we accept that these tribes once lived together as a single unified people. Many of these family names appear to originate from an older dialect, as they are not commonly used in the contemporary Fanti language. Furthermore, despite the wide dispersion of clan members, a sense of brotherhood still persists among them. The customary laws practiced by all Akan peoples, though they exhibit slight regional variations, just as their dialects do, are fundamentally identical in principle, pointing unmistakably to a shared origin. The same can be said for their religious practices, customs, and local governance systems. Writing in 1811, Meredith supports the notion of a common origin for the Fantis, and also provides an account of their early governance along the coast. He notes, "The Fantis were originally an inland people, governed by the kings of Ashantis. But when they formed a separate state, there are no clear records to determine when this occurred. They eventually rebelled against Ashanti rule and fled toward the sea, where they appeared to remain unchallenged until recently. Once they felt secure and considered themselves beyond Ashanti dominion, they appointed a leader. However, fearing that this leader might betray them for favor or reward, they devised a unique test of loyalty. They demanded that he consent to lose his left hand as proof of his dedication to their cause. The man hesitated at this unusual test, prompting discontent among the people. At this point, his cane-bearer stepped forward, declaring that if his master was unwilling to sacrifice a hand for the good of the people, he would. He placed his left arm on the block, and it was severed. This man was then appointed their brafo, meaning captain or leader, and was endowed with many privileges. His family was provided for and considered a kind of nobility, and his authority was nearly absolute. According to Bosman, however, the power of the brafo was initially checked by a council of elders, which operated much like a European parliament, acting independently without consulting the brafo. It was only later that the brafos began to usurp more authority, and their rule became so oppressive and unpopular that their powers were expressly curtailed. In addition to the Akans, there are several other tribes, particularly in the Northern Territories, about whose origins little is known. These regions also contain many colonies of Hausas and Fulanis scattered throughout the country. Although more is known about the early history of these groups, they are considered foreigners in the land and cannot rightfully be counted among the native tribes of the Gold Coast. The intricate social, political, and cultural dynamics within the Gold Coast region, as illustrated by these traditions and historical records, reflect a complex tapestry of migration, conflict, and adaptation. The mingling of different tribes and the evolution of their governance systems over time demonstrate the resilience and adaptability of these communities in the face of external threats and internal divisions. The story of the Gold Coast is not just one of conquest and resistance, but also of cultural preservation, social cohesion, and the continuous shaping of a shared identity amidst diversity. These are the reasons why we have so many tribes in Ghana, each with its own distinct history and origin story. The complex tapestry of migration, adaptation, and survival has given rise to a nation rich in cultural diversity. From the Ashantis to the Fantis, from the coastal regions to the Northern Territories, every tribe in Ghana carries with it a unique narrative. Stories passed down through generations, shaped by the landscapes they traveled and the challenges they overcame. Each tribe's story offers a different perspective on how they came to settle in the Gold Coast, and these varied accounts collectively contribute to the rich cultural heritage of Ghana. The traditions, languages and customs we see today are all reflections of this intricate past, where history is not just a series of events, but a living, breathing part of each community's identity. What is your point of view on this fascinating history? Do you see it as a reflection of the strength and resilience of these tribes, or perhaps as an ongoing journey of cultural evolution? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please share where you are watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more captivating content like this. Your engagement helps us continue exploring and sharing these important narratives, keeping the history and culture of Ghana alive for future generations.